A blizzard howled across the Montana plains, the wind screaming through barbed wire and whipping snow into sharp, icy curtains that erased the horizon. Out here, winter didn't arrive so much as descend, like some old spirit meant to test the living. Most folks in this part of Powder River County had learned to hunker down and wait it out. Not Charlotte Keene. She was out there anyway, walking the broken fence line in her thick wool coat, boots sinking with each step, shoulders hunched against the world. That battered Stetson she wore had belonged to her husband, now gone almost as long as he'd been around. Every year since her daughter's accident, Charlotte had become quieter, harder, and a little more stubborn. That's what loss did, she supposed. Turned your heart brittle, your habits rigid. But that day, as dusk painted the sky a strange lavender, Charlotte spotted something out past the last gate, near where the old fence met the county road. A dark, awkward shape, half buried in snow. For a moment she thought it was another fallen limb, a trick of wind and shadow, but as she trudged closer, heart beating with a tight, old ache she wouldn't name, she saw what it really was. A horse. A battered brown gelding, bigger than most, with a ragged rope halter biting into his head and legs stiff as fence posts. His breath came in slow, shuddering bursts that made the frost steam off his muzzle. One of his eyes was crusted shut, and the other, wide, wild, and glassy, tracked her every move. She stopped a few feet away, hands tucked in her pockets. "Well," she muttered, "aren't you a sorry sight?" The gelding didn't spook or bolt. He just stood there, barely trembling. Charlotte looked up and down the empty road. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest where the animal had come from or how long he'd been caught in the storm. The only clue was that frayed halter and the deep, dark line around his neck, rubbed raw from something rough. Charlotte hesitated, her breath billowing in the cold. The barn was warm and safe, but she hadn't let anything or anyone into her life. Not really, since her daughter, Rachel, died. And she sure as hell hadn't opened her home to strays. But as she watched the horse sway in the wind, something inside her cracked. Just a hair. She whistled softly. The gelding's ear flicked. "Come on, big guy," she said, stepping forward, boots crunching ice. "Let's not both freeze out here." It took coaxing. Low words, patient steps, arms stretched wide so he'd see she meant no harm. The horse let her touch his nose. Finally, his skin twitched, but he didn't shy. Charlotte felt the tremor running through his muscles, the exhaustion. She reached into her pocket, found a sugar cube left over from last spring, and pressed it to his cracked lips. He chewed it slowly, as if remembering the taste. Leading him was another matter. Every step was a struggle for both of them. Charlotte's boots slipping, the horse staggering, her fingers numb as she gripped the rope. The walk to the barn seemed endless. The wind howled, stinging her face. Every so often the horse would stop, sides heaving, and Charlotte would pause beside him, hand on his shoulder, whispering nonsense to keep him going. When they finally made it to the old red barn, Charlotte fumbled the latch open, yanked the door wide, and guided him inside. The warmth hit them like a wave. The horse hesitated, nostrils flaring, but she clicked her tongue and tugged gently until he followed. And inside, she spread fresh straw in the empty stall, grabbing extra armfuls to build a thick nest. She fetched a wool blanket, her husband's old army surplus, faded olive and full of holes, and draped it over the gelding's back. He shivered, but he didn't fight. In the doorway, a small figure hovered. Nina. 9 years old, pale and thin, her hair still wild from sleep, clutching a stuffed bear by one limp arm. She watched, as silent as a ghost, her eyes enormous in the barn's low light. Charlotte hadn't seen her granddaughter cry in weeks, but she hadn't heard her speak either, not since the funeral. Not since that terrible crash stole Rachel and Nina's father and turned all their lives upside down. Now, Nina was just there, a shadow, following Charlotte everywhere, refusing to speak, as if words themselves had died with her parents. Charlotte pretended not to notice the girl's bare feet on the barn boards. "Get some socks on before you catch cold," she said, voice rough. But Nina didn't move, just stood there and watched as Charlotte poured out a scoop of grain, checked the gelding's water bucket, and found some ointment for the wound around his eye. That night, the wind battered the barn, rattling the doors, shaking the eaves. Charlotte sat on a hay bale beside the stall, rubbing her hands together, listening to the horse breathe. Slow, steady, alive. She didn't know if he'd make it through till morning. She didn't know if she cared. But something about his stubbornness, the way he stood there, refusing to fall, echoed in her own tired bones. Later, when the hour grew late and the oil lamp guttered, Charlotte made her way back to the house, her body aching from cold and effort. The kitchen light was still on, casting a yellow glow over the worn linoleum. She poured herself a mug of tea, staring out the frosted window, unable to shake the image of the horse's battered body from her mind. Was she crazy for bringing him in, for caring at all? Sometime after midnight, she padded back to the barn to check on things one last time. The snow had stopped, leaving a thick, heavy silence. She eased open the door, letting her eyes adjust to the dark. In the straw, curled up like a kitten near the stall, was Nina, fast asleep, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. And the horse, his breathing slow and deep, stood just inches away, watching over her. Charlotte's throat tightened. She stepped quietly inside, covered Nina with another blanket, and sat on the floor beside them. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite so alone. The three of them, woman, girl, and horse, were all broken in different ways. Maybe that was just how it worked. Maybe, sometimes, the lost ones found each other. Outside, the moon rose over the snow, silent and full. Inside, in the warmth and quiet, the healing, slow, uncertain, stubborn, had already begun. The next 2 days crawled by, the snow piled deep along the fence lines, and the old barn felt both smaller and warmer for the company inside. Charlotte rose before sunrise, as she always had. Habit was stubborn, even when you no longer had anyone else to set your clock by. She boiled water, made 2 mugs of weak coffee, one for herself, one left untouched at the end of the kitchen table, and then pulled on her coat, bracing for another cold morning in Montana. When she pushed open the barn door, a familiar sharpness bit her cheeks, but the air inside was different now, alive with the slow, nervous sound of a horse not yet sure he belonged. Hickory, as Nina had started calling him in her quiet, secret way, stood in the far corner of his stall. He didn't move when Charlotte entered, nor when she set out fresh grain in a bucket of water, nor even when she checked the blanket's position and the crusted wound near his eye. Only his ears flicked, and his gaze, still wary, still hollowed by something old and deep, tracked her every movement. Charlotte kept her hands steady, her motions slow and deliberate. She knew horses, or at least she'd known a few in her time, but Hickory was different. He flinched at every sudden sound, the wind rattling the eaves, a shovel scraping, even the quiet creak of the barn door. His flanks tensed when Charlotte reached for him. She didn't try to touch him, not at first. Some scars, she knew, ran deeper than flesh. He didn't eat for the first 2 days. Not really. He sniffed at the hay and pawed at the grain, but took nothing. Once, Charlotte tried to offer him an apple. He nudged it with his nose, then turned away. She muttered to herself, "Suit yourself, partner." But it bothered her more than she'd admit. She kept coming back to the barn, anyway, checking on him, sometimes just standing in the quiet with him for long stretches, listening to his breaths echo through the rafters. Nina spent even more time in the barn. She seemed to move without sound, 1 minute in the kitchen, the next curled up in a corner of Hickory's stall, her knees drawn to her chest, a battered box of crayons by her side. She didn't speak. She didn't even hum. She just drew. Sometimes it was Hickory, huge, clumsy, with sad eyes and a drooping head. Sometimes it was her mother's old car, or a house surrounded by stick-figure people, or wild, swirling clouds with tiny hearts tucked inside. The colors spilled across scraps of cardboard and yellowed notebook paper, as if the only words Nina could find anymore lived in crayon. Charlotte watched all this from a distance, pretending not to care. She kept busy in the kitchen, baking bread she wouldn't eat, cleaning cabinets that didn't need cleaning, her eyes always drifting back toward the barn. She caught herself listening for the faint crunch of Nina's boots on snow, for the sudden clatter of hooves, for anything that might mean change. She'd never been much for talking, not even before Rachel died. Now every silence in the house felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, reminding her of everything she'd lost. On the third morning, just as the frost on the window panes began to melt, Charlotte found Nina sitting on a bale of hay, sketching Hickory with extra care. The horse watched the girl with the same exhausted patience he gave the wind and the cold. There was a gentleness to Nina's presence, something almost animal, something that didn't demand anything from him but space. Charlotte cleared her throat, making her presence known. "Any luck getting him to eat?" she asked, more to fill the quiet than anything else. Nina didn't answer, didn't look up, but Charlotte saw her hand pause, just for a second, as if the question hung in the air, heavy and hard. That afternoon, something changed. Charlotte brought in a fresh bucket of water, and Hickory startled at the slosh, eyes wide and white-rimmed. But instead of backing away, he turned slightly toward Nina, who had been humming ever so faintly, one of those tuneless, half-remembered melodies that children invent for themselves. Charlotte watched as Nina, still silent, held out her hand, palm open and fingers relaxed, just as her father had taught her years ago. Hickory sniffed her mitten, the motion cautious but deliberate. Then, in a small gesture that made Charlotte's breath catch, he nuzzled her hand, his lips soft and trembling. Nina didn't move, didn't flinch, just let him be. For the first time since he'd arrived, his body seemed to relax, the hard lines of his back softening, his ears lowering from rigid alertness. Charlotte pretended not to notice, but she saw it all. The subtle, almost invisible way Nina's posture shifted, her shoulders uncoiling, her jaw unclenching. She looked smaller suddenly, but also less brittle, as if the world had given her just a sliver of peace in that moment. That night, as Charlotte sipped her tea at the kitchen window, she watched the barn from afar, the lamplight leaking through cracks in the wood. She could just make out Nina's silhouette, curled up by the stall. She wondered what secrets passed between her granddaughter and that broken horse. What pain, what hope, what silent bargains of trust and understanding. She wondered if healing could ever come in silence, or if it needed words to take root. Charlotte told herself that she was just being practical, that she'd have to find Hickory's owner soon, that there were rules and forms and responsibilities. But deep down, she knew she wasn't ready, not yet, to send him away. There was something in his scars, something in Nina's silence that felt familiar. Maybe they were all just waiting for something to change. Maybe they were all just flinching, waiting to see if the world would hurt them again. As the wind died down that night, a fragile quiet settled over the property. For the first time in weeks, Charlotte let herself hope, just a little, that maybe, in this cold, harsh season, something might take root. That maybe, just maybe, broken things could find their way back to each other. The sun rose slowly over the Montana plains, its light pushing through the frosted windows of Charlotte's old farmhouse and painting the world in a pale, hesitant gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep that every sound in the barn felt magnified. A hoof scraping straw, the muted crunch of snow outside, the soft rhythmic breathing of Hickory in his stall. The air inside the barn was warmer now, sweet with hay and horse, as if life itself was inching back in from the edges of winter. On that third morning, Charlotte found Nina in the barn before breakfast, her small body bundled in layers of sweaters, the tip of her nose already pink from cold. The girl was crouched by Hickory's stall, sorting through a pile of colored pencils and scrap paper. Her drawings from the past few days littered the barn floor, some careful and detailed, others wild and abstract, all of them filled with silent longing. Hickory stood in the far corner, head lowered, sides rising and falling in the slow, deliberate breaths. He watched Nina, as if waiting for permission to exist. His scars, visible even in the dim light, seemed less angry now. Just a part of him, not the whole story. The swelling around his eye was going down, and the stiffness in his legs had started to ease. But still, he didn't eat much, and he flinched at every sharp noise, every movement out of place. Charlotte leaned on the stall door, mug of coffee warming her hands. She watched the way Nina moved. Careful, patient, her gestures soft and non-threatening. It reminded Charlotte of the way Rachel, her daughter, had been with animals. Some people forced themselves into the world of creatures. Others waited to be invited. Nina was the latter, content to just sit nearby, letting Hickory decide when he was ready. After a while, Charlotte cleared her throat and said, "If you're going to spend all morning out here, you can at least make yourself useful." Her voice was gruff, but there was an undercurrent of something softer, a plea for connection she wasn't ready to voice. Nina looked up, eyes wide, and waited. Charlotte handed her the manure fork and showed her how to shovel the soiled straw into a wheelbarrow. She demonstrated how to mix mash in the feed bucket, warm water, oats, a little molasses for sweetness. Nina followed every instruction without a word, moving with a quiet efficiency that was almost eerie in a child so young. Together, they worked in silence, the only sounds the creak of the barn and the gentle clink of tools. At first, Hickory watched from a distance, tense and suspicious. But as the days passed and the chores became routine, he began to follow Nina's movements with growing curiosity. When she filled his water bucket, he edged closer, sniffing her mitten before pulling back. When she swept the aisle, he poked his nose over the stall door, ears pricked forward, waiting for her to notice. Charlotte watched these small interactions with guarded hope, telling herself not to expect too much. One afternoon, as Charlotte refilled the hay racks and Nina swept the aisle, a snowplow rumbled past on the county road. The sound was sudden, loud, and sharp, enough to send most horses into a panic. Hickory's ears flicked back, and his muscles tensed, but he didn't bolt or kick. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at Nina. The girl froze, heart pounding, but stayed still. That moment changed everything. Nina, for the first time in 2 months, opened her mouth and whispered, "He's not scared." Her voice was small, raspy from disuse, but it echoed through the barn like a bell. She hadn't spoken since the funeral, not a single word, not a single sound. Now, with those 3 words, the silence of grief cracked open. Charlotte, who'd been standing in the shadow by the door, felt her knees buckle. She leaned against the door frame, blinking back tears she didn't want to show. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the sound of a child's voice in her home, how much she'd missed laughter, chatter, the easy music of daily life. For a moment she let herself remember the way Rachel used to sing while mucking stalls, the way her husband used to hum under his breath while fixing fence posts. Loss had taken all those sounds away, left her with nothing but empty rooms and memories that hurt to touch. But now, there was a crack in the dam. Nina, shy and trembling, reached out to touch Hickory's neck. The horse flinched at first, then relaxed under her gentle hand. Charlotte watched as her granddaughter pressed her cheek to the gelding's mane, her breath mingling with the animal's. There was a stillness in the barn, a shared quiet that felt sacred, like the world had paused to bear witness to something rare. After that, things shifted. Nina began to talk in whispers. Just to Hickory at first, telling him stories about the colors she saw in the sky, the shapes she drew, the memories of a life that once was full. She whispered secrets into his ear, promised him that he was safe, that he could stay as long as he needed. Hickory listened, his big brown eyes soft and understanding, as if he knew what it was to lose everything and start again. Charlotte, still cautious, tried not to hope too much. She worried about the future, about what would happen if Hickory's owner came looking, or if Nina retreated back into silence. But every day, She watched the two of them grow closer, watched Nina's color return, and her eyes shined a little brighter. She started to talk to Nina, too, about chores, about the weather, about small, simple things. The girl didn't always answer, but she listened, and that was enough. On the 7th day, as the afternoon light spilled golden across the pasture, Charlotte saw something she would remember for the rest of her life. Nina walked out of the barn, shovel in hand, and Hickory followed her. No rope, no coaxing, just a gentle trust built on shared pain. They walked together from stall to pasture, step for step, as if bound by an invisible thread. Charlotte watched them go, a lump in her throat, hope blossoming slow and shy in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that healing was possible. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in small, steady steps. Sometimes, it turned out, the first sound after silence wasn't a cry or a scream. Sometimes it was a whisper, a promise that life, for all its hurt, could still be beautiful. Winter in Montana meant days that blurred together. Snow and mud, chores and silence, the air forever scented with wood smoke and hay. But for Nina, those days had begun to carry new meaning. Each morning, she slipped out to the barn before the sun was fully up, a ritual that Charlotte never questioned aloud, but always noticed. She would find the girl sitting in the straw, humming quietly, sometimes reading old horse magazines aloud to Hickory as he drowsed in his stall. Other times, Nina would just sketch, her hands smudged with color, her drawings slowly taking on more hope than heartbreak. One afternoon, with the worst of winter's fury behind them, and the snow melting into thick, muddy ruts along the driveway, Charlotte drove Nina into town for supplies. It was the sort of outing that used to be routine. A quick stop at the feed store for pellets and liniment, maybe a detour to the hardware shop. But ever since Rachel's accident, even the simplest trips felt heavy. Charlotte tried to keep her eyes forward, focusing on the road, but she could feel Nina's anxiety beside her, small hands twisting the hem of her sleeve. The feed store smelled of grain, old leather, and sawdust, a comforting scent that brought Charlotte back to years when Rachel was a child, always running ahead, giggling, pulling her toward the tack aisle. Now, Nina walked slowly, her eyes darting over racks of brushes, salt blocks, and buckets, saying nothing but soaking it all in. Charlotte picked out what she needed, exchanged stiff pleasantries with the clerk, and was halfway to the register when Nina stopped dead in her tracks, staring at a bulletin board near the door. "Look," she finally whispered, voice trembling with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Pinned among lost dog flyers, equipment ads, and notices for pancake breakfast was a bright, slightly crumpled flyer. Winter Horsemanship Showcase. Beginner's Welcome. There was a sketch of a child leading a pony through an obstacle course, blue and gold ribbons fluttering in cartoon wind, and in blocky handwriting, details about divisions for all ages. No experience necessary. Charlotte's heart gave a little twist. She knew these events well enough, mostly local kids, a few nervous parents, ranchers with an eye for talent and an appetite for gossip. The showcase was more about community than competition, but it could be rough for newcomers. Still, Nina's eyes sparkled with a hope Charlotte hadn't seen in months. "You want to go watch?" Charlotte asked, careful not to make any promises. Nina nodded, eyes never leaving the flyer. Charlotte hesitated. Hickory was hardly in shape for anything, with his coat still patchy and that old wound around his eye. Besides, and Nina had only just started to find her voice again, but something about her granddaughter's quiet determination made it hard to say no. "All right," Charlotte sighed, offering a small, rare smile. "We'll go, just to watch." The next few days, Nina became a whirlwind of energy. She spent every spare moment with Hickory, brushing out his tangled mane, gently cleaning the old scars with warm water, whispering encouragements as she worked. Charlotte, for her part, let herself get swept up in Nina's excitement, fixing up the old trailer, polishing her boots, laying out an old, clean saddle pad just in case. She watched as Nina guided Hickory through makeshift obstacles, buckets, brooms, empty feed bags tied to posts. her gentle persistence slowly drawing the gelding out of his shell. Each time he hesitated, Nina spoke softly. "It's okay. I'm right here." Hickory learned to trust those words, and little by little, to trust her touch. The morning of the showcase dawned clear and biting cold, the sky a pale blue, and the air sharp with the promise of another storm. Charlotte loaded Hickory into the trailer with more hope than confidence, the old horse stepping up with only a slight hesitation. Nina climbed into the passenger seat, her drawings tucked safely in her backpack for luck, and they set off across the snowy roads. At the county fairgrounds, the scene was both familiar and daunting. Trucks and trailers lined up in muddy rows, horses of every color and size shifting nervously in makeshift pens. Parents fussed over children, adjusting helmets and wiping noses, while old ranchers leaned against the fences, arms folded, eyes keen and curious. As Charlotte unloaded Hickory, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. The gelding's coat, though cleaner, was still patchy. His scars were plain as day beneath the winter sunlight. Some of the other kids glanced over, whispering behind gloved hands. A few parents offered polite, pitying smiles. But there were those who didn't bother to hide their disdain. Wade Clay, a sharp-tongued rancher whose family had been in these parts longer than the roads, gave a low, mocking laugh as they walked past. "That glue bag yours, Charlotte?" he called, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "He looks half dead already." Charlotte's fists clenched, knuckles white inside her gloves. She bit back, the retort burning in her chest, unwilling to give Wade the satisfaction. Instead, she focused on Nina, who had walked quietly to Hickory's side, her hand resting gently on his nose. Nina didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she stroked Hickory's on his muzzle, whispering a reassurance meant only for him. All around them, the showcase buzzed with nervous energy. Kids led ponies through barrel patterns, zigzagged between cones, tried their best at ground tying or halter work. There were ribbons for the winners, hot chocolate for everyone else, and the air was filled with laughter, groans, and the occasional outburst of tears. Nina watched it all with wide, careful eyes, learning the rhythm of each event, the way some horses responded to pressure and others to patience. Their turn came in the walk-along division, or a simple event for beginners, meant to test the bond between horse and handler. The rules were straightforward. Lead your horse through an obstacle course without using reins, only your voice, your presence, and your trust. Charlotte watched as Nina took a deep breath, hands shaking only a little as she unclipped the lead. She stepped forward, past the line of bright orange cones, over a tarp laid flat on the ground, and around a scattering of plastic barrels. Hickory followed, his steps slow and measured, never faltering. Each obstacle tested their faith in each other, a plastic bag fluttering in the wind, a low rail to step over, a sudden sharp bark from a nearby dog. Each time Nina spoke softly, and each time Hickory listened. By the time they reached the end of the course, a hush had fallen over the crowd. No ribbon, no trophy, just a few scattered claps, and then, as if by agreement, 2 ranch wives started applauding, quiet but steady. Charlotte heard someone nearby murmur, "He trusts her." The words rang truer than any victory. That night, back home in the barn, Nina carefully pinned the showcase flyer above Hickory's stall. She smoothed out the edges, making sure it was perfectly straight, and then stepped back to admire it, her smile small but genuine. Charlotte watched from the doorway, the weight in her chest finally lifting, just a little. She didn't take the flyer down, not that night, not ever. Snow lingered in shadowy patches along the fence lines, while the spring sun did its best to melt winter's grip on the Montana fields. The day after the showcase, everything on the Keene Ranch seemed changed, even if the world outside was slow to catch up. Hickory, still patchy and rough around the edges, stood in his stall with a new sense of belonging. Nina's drawings of blue ribbons and clapping hands decorated the barn wall, her silent message of hope lingering in every corner. Charlotte tried to hide how proud she felt. She swept the barn aisle and ran her hand along the smooth boards of Hickory's stall, pretending not to watch as Nina fussed over the old gelding. Nina hummed softly as she brushed out tangles from Hickory's mane. The sound filled the barn with warmth, like the memory of a song Rachel used to sing. There was a lightness about Nina now, a quiet strength. her grief no longer the only thing that filled the space between them. 3 days after the showcase, the town's riding club invited beginners to a demonstration at the indoor arena. "No reins," the flyer said. "Let your horse follow your lead." It was meant to be a lesson in trust, nothing more. Charlotte hesitated, worrying that Hickory was still too skittish, too worn from his past life, and that Nina, her granddaughter, who had just begun to find her voice again, was still too fragile. But Nina surprised her. "I want to try," she whispered, meeting Charlotte's eyes with a determination that defied her small frame. Charlotte nodded, swallowing her worries. "All right, honey, we'll do it together." That morning, they loaded Hickory into the trailer. Charlotte drove with one eye on the rearview mirror, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Nina sat beside her, clutching her newest sketchbook. The sky was clear, but the air held the chill of winter's tale. At the arena, families gathered along the rails, children bundled in bright jackets, parents snapping photos and sipping thermoses of coffee. Some faces Charlotte recognized: the ranch wives who'd clapped at the showcase, old Doc Garvey from the feed store, and, lingering near the back, Wade Clay, arms folded, mouth curled into a sneer, always ready to pounce on weakness. Charlotte forced herself to ignore him. She focused on Nina, who stood quietly, stroking Hickory's nose. The old horse was restless, shifting from foot to foot, his ears swiveling at every sound. The lights overhead hummed, echoing through the cavernous building. The demonstration began with older kids leading their ponies through a series of obstacles, cones, hula hoops, and even a tarp that crinkled under hoof. Some horses balked, others pranced confidently. Ribbons were given for courage, not speed. When Nina's turn came, she handed Charlotte the lead rope, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the ring. For a moment, the noise and bustle faded. It was just Nina and Hickory under the harsh arena lights, their shadows long and soft on the packed dirt. The obstacle course was simple: weave between cones, step over a low pole, stop at a painted circle. But without reins, every movement relied on trust, a test of connection, not control. Nina started walking, slow and steady. She didn't look back. Hickory watched her for a beat, then took a tentative step, then another, following at her side. She paused at the first cone, her small hand hovering as if to signal him. Hickory stopped, mirroring her. The hush that fell over the arena was complete. No whispers, no laughter, just the sound of hooves on dirt and the soft shuffle of Nina's boots. They moved together, Nina guiding with only her body, Hickory watching her every motion. When she slowed, he slowed. When she picked up her pace, he matched her stride. At the crinkling tarp, Hickory's muscles tensed. He tossed his head, the old scar by his eye twitching. For a moment, Charlotte's heart leaped into her throat. Nina turned and whispered, "It's okay. I'm not scared." The words floated across the ring, barely more than a breath, but Hickory heard. He dropped his head and walked calmly across the tarp, the plastic snapping underfoot but failing to break the spell. At the last obstacle, a painted circle, Nina stopped and waited. Hickory drew up beside her, his breath steaming in the cool air. The silence stretched, then someone in the stands began to clap, softly, almost unsure. Another joined in, then another, until the whole crowd was applauding. No ribbons were handed out for this round, no trophies displayed. Instead, Charlotte caught the eyes of the ranch wives, who'd clapped before, their smiles wide and genuine. Even Doc Garvey tipped his hat, murmuring, "Takes real heart, that one." Not everyone was kind. Wade Clay muttered, "Luck, not skill," loud enough for Charlotte to hear. She bristled, but Nina didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on Hickory, on the fragile, perfect moment they had built together from the ruins of fear. After the demonstration, Nina ran her hand down Hickory's neck, her touch gentle but confident. She led him from the ring and into the barn, where Charlotte waited, blinking back tears. Nina's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, and for the first time in a long while, her smile seemed to reach all the way through her. Back home that night, Nina pulled the demonstration flyer from her pocket and pinned it beside the showcase flyer in the barn. The wall was becoming a gallery of their journey. Every step, every risk, every silent victory. Charlotte watched as Nina sat in the straw, sketching Hickory standing tall and proud, his scars faded, his eyes bright. Charlotte stood at the doorway, hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. She thought of all the days spent lost in grief, of all the times she'd wondered if the silence would ever break. Now, in the warmth of the barn, she understood. Healing didn't come in grand gestures. It crept in slowly, with small acts of courage, a walk without reins, a gentle word, a shared moment of trust. Sometimes the world measured success in ribbons and applause. Charlotte knew better. She saw it in the way Nina looked at Hickory, in the way the old horse followed without needing to be led. Some victories could be pinned to a wall or measured by others. They lived in the quiet places, in the space between fear and hope. That night, Charlotte let herself rest easy for the first time in months. She listened to the wind outside, the steady breathing of horse and child in the barn, and allowed herself to dream of a tomorrow built on trust, not sorrow. A pale blue dawn crawled across the eastern sky, turning the windows of the Keene farmhouse to rectangles of silver light. The air outside was crisp, cold enough to bite through gloves, but the kind of cold that hinted at spring waiting just beneath the surface. Charlotte Keene woke up before her alarm, as always, but there was an odd hush in the house, a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. She sat on the edge of her bed, blinking sleep from her eyes, and listened. No sound of Nina's footsteps on the old floorboards, no muffled humming, not even the creak of barn doors drifting across the yard. Just stillness. She moved quickly through her morning routine, shrugging into her thickest flannel shirt, yanking on boots, and shrugging into her battered winter coat. She poured 2 mugs of tea, one for herself, one left waiting out of habit, and set them on the counter. Then she stepped outside, bracing herself for the morning chores and, she hoped, the sight of Nina already in the barn. But when she opened the barn door, the world spun sideways. Hickory's stall was empty. Straw lay flattened, the old blanket tossed into a heap in the corner. The door to the stall hung open. For a moment, Charlotte stared, heart pounding so hard she thought she might faint. She blinked, willing her mind to catch up, to find a rational explanation. Maybe Hickory had gotten loose, wandered to the far field. Maybe Nina had taken him out for an early ride, though she'd never do that without telling Charlotte. Maybe this was all some kind of misunderstanding, a blip in the steady rhythm they'd fought so hard to build. Charlotte hurried out into the yard, boots crunching on the icy path, eyes scanning the pasture. But the only tracks in the fresh snow were her own. No hoof prints, no small boot prints, not even the telltale scatter of disturbed straw that should have marked a horse's passage. It was as if Hickory had vanished into thin air. A sick feeling twisted in her gut. She called out for Nina, her voice echoing sharp across the yard. No answer. She ran to the house, flinging open the front door. She found Nina on the couch, knees hugged to her chest, face buried in her arms. The child's body shook with silent sobs, shoulders trembling, fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Charlotte rushed to her, gathering Nina into her arms, holding her close, whispering, "It's all right, baby. I'm here. I'm here." But it wasn't all right. It was a nightmare, the kind of loss that felt too familiar, too cruel. Charlotte rocked Nina, stroking her tangled hair, trying to calm her enough to get the story out. Through hiccuping breaths, Nina finally choked out, "He's gone. He's gone." Charlotte's mind spun, latching onto questions, possible explanations. "Did you see anything? Did you hear anything last night?" Nina shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I heard a truck. Late. I thought it was a dream." Charlotte's heart sank. She hugged Nina tighter, pressing her lips to the top of her granddaughter's head. Hickory hadn't escaped. Someone had taken him, right out from under their noses. Anger welled up, hot and fierce, and she fought to keep it hidden from Nina. The Keen women had endured enough loss. She would not let this stand. She set Nina on the couch, wrapped her in a thick blanket, and promised, "I'll find him, I swear it." Charlotte started with the obvious. She called the nearest animal shelters, her voice brisk but polite, asking if anyone had brought in a stray horse. Brown gelding, scarred face, one eye still healing. No one had seen anything. Next, she phoned every neighbor and rancher in a 10-mile radius, describing Hickory in detail, asking if anyone had spotted a horse loose or a trailer passing by in the night. The answers came back empty, one after another. With each fruitless call, Charlotte's worry deepened. She heard the tightness in her own voice, the urgency that made old friends promise to keep an eye out, to call if they heard a whisper. She set her jaw, refusing to let despair creep in. She'd lost too much to give up now. After a long morning of phone calls and pacing, Charlotte heard a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Dale, a ranch hand from up the road, a young man with honest eyes and the rough hands of someone who worked hard for a living. He hesitated, shifting his weight, as if he hated being the bearer of bad news. "Charlotte," he said, voice low, "I heard something this morning. Wade Clay was hauling out early, before dawn, had his trailer hitched up, didn't say where he was going." Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Wade Clay? The same man who'd mocked Hickory at the showcase, who'd sneered at Charlotte every chance he got. She felt her pulse quicken, a surge of adrenaline sharpening her focus. Wade had never liked outsiders, two-legged or four. He'd always believed the world belonged to men like him, and everyone else was just trespassing. "Thank you, Dale," Charlotte said. "That helps more than you know." She returned inside, knelt by Nina, and tried to sound braver than she felt. "We're not giving up," she said, "but we might need some help." There was one person Charlotte trusted for matters like this, her old firefighting partner, Marcy Simmons, who'd retired from the department and now worked as a sheriff's deputy. Marcy was tough as nails, knew everyone in 3 counties, and, more importantly, knew how to ask questions without making enemies. Charlotte dialed her number, and Marcy picked up on the first ring. "Keen," Marcy barked. "It's been too long." "What's wrong?" Charlotte filled her in. Every detail, every suspicion. Marcy listened in silence, her breathing steady. "You think Wade took him?" she asked when Charlotte finished. "I'd bet on it," Charlotte replied, anger seeping into her tone. "But I don't have proof." Marcy grunted. "Let me make a few calls. Sit tight, and don't do anything stupid. You hear me?" Charlotte managed a grim laugh. No promises. When she hung up, she found Nina standing at the kitchen window, staring out toward the empty barn. Her face was pale, her eyes haunted, but beneath it all was a spark. Determination, the stubborn fire she'd inherited from generations of Keen women. "Don't worry," Charlotte said, placing a steadying hand on Nina's shoulder. "We'll get him back, I promise." The rest of the day passed in a blur of worry, anger, and the relentless grind of waiting. Charlotte forced herself to keep moving, cleaning, chopping wood, checking every corner of the barn and pasture as if Hickory might materialize out of thin air. Nina barely ate, barely spoke, but she stuck close to Charlotte's side, refusing to be left alone. The bond between them, forged in loss, grew stronger still. That night, as the stars blinked coldly overhead and the ranch lay silent, Charlotte sat by the window, watching for headlights on the long, empty road. She would not sleep, not really. She would wait and plan and hope. Somewhere out there, Hickory was waiting too, and she would not let him down. The Keen farmhouse stood in uneasy silence, the kind of silence that settles over a home when hope feels like a thread ready to snap. Charlotte slept little, keeping vigil by the window long after midnight, her eyes stinging from lack of sleep and too many cups of stale coffee. Every so often she would see Nina, wrapped in a blanket, drifting from room to room like a restless spirit, unable to settle, unwilling to accept Hickory's absence. Each hour that passed seemed to hollow them out a little more, as if a piece of the barn's warmth had been carted away with the horse. Morning came, cold and blue and silent as the grave. Charlotte went through the motions: coffee, Boots, chores, her hands moving on autopilot. She called Marcy again, her old firefighting partner now a deputy, but the woman's update was the same as before. No sightings, no reports. Wade Clay's trailer still missing. The sheriff's office couldn't do much without proof, and proof was as scarce as good hay after a harsh winter. Charlotte slammed the phone down, fighting the urge to break something when Nina padded into the kitchen, her face puffy from crying, but her eyes burning with a new sort of determination. She clutched a battered keychain in her fist, the kind that looked like a cheap toy. Its plastic case faded and cracked. Charlotte frowned, puzzled, as Nina placed it on the kitchen table. I remembered something, Nina whispered, her voice brittle but clear. The GPS. The one Dad gave me. Charlotte's heart skipped. She picked up the keychain, turning it over in her palm, realizing it was one of those simple tracking devices you could slip into a backpack or a lunchbox, something Nina's dad had insisted on after reading one too many cautionary tales online. Nina's lips trembled as she explained. We put it in Hickory's halter, just for fun. Before the showcase, I forgot about it. For the first time in days, Charlotte felt a surge of hope. Do you know how to find the signal? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Nina nodded. She retrieved her battered tablet from the couch, swiping through apps with trembling fingers. The GPS program loaded slowly, too slowly, but finally, a blinking green dot appeared on a map of the county. The signal was weak but clear, and it pulsed near the edge of Cascade, a patchwork of ranch land about 40 miles northwest of their own property. Charlotte's jaw clenched. Cascade. Wade Clay's cousin owned a spread out that way, a place with more outbuildings than livestock, notorious for dodging paperwork and minding his own business. A cold certainty settled in Charlotte's bones. That's where he is, she said, meeting Nina's eyes. That's where they took him. They moved fast. Charlotte called Marcy, relaying the news and asking if a warrant could be rushed. But the deputy just sighed, her voice heavy with regret. Without hard evidence of a crime, all I can do is show up and ask questions. If you go, don't do anything reckless. But Charlotte was already packing snacks and water bottles, her resolve as unyielding as the mountains. She bundled Nina in her heaviest coat, double-checked the address on the GPS map, and set off down the highway, the sun climbing higher behind them, melting the last of the ice from the roads. As they drove, the tension in the truck grew thick. Nina clutched her bear in the tablet, watching the little green dot move as the GPS refreshed. The closer they got to Cascade, the more Charlotte's mind raced. What if Wade had moved Hickory? What if the battery died? What if the Clay family caught wind and covered their tracks? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on what she could control, staying calm, keeping Nina safe, and finding Hickory before nightfall. The Clay cousins' ranch sat at the end of a rutted gravel road, the kind where mailboxes leaned drunkenly and tumbleweed caught on the barbed wire. A battered pickup was parked by the gate, and a low metal building stood beside a weather-beaten barn. Charlotte parked just beyond the rise, hidden from the house, and shut off the engine. For a long moment, she and Nina sat in silence, listening to the wind moan through the sagebrush. Charlotte squeezed Nina's hand. We're just here to look. Nothing more. You stay with me, and if anything feels wrong, you get back in the truck. Understand? Nina nodded, eyes huge in her pale face. They approached the barn, on foot, boots crunching in last autumn's dead grass. The GPS signal pulsed steadily in Nina's hand, the dot now just a few yards away. From inside the barn, Charlotte could hear the soft shifting of animals. Cows, a goat maybe, the restless stomp of hooves. She ducked under a broken window, peering into the gloom. Inside, the barn was cluttered with junk, old machinery, rusted feed bins, stacks of pallets. But Charlotte's eyes went straight to the row of horse stalls along the far wall. A faint light filtered through a crack in the roof, illuminating the silhouette of a large horse standing quietly behind the bars. Charlotte's breath caught. Even from here, she recognized the shape. The droop of the head, the battered profile, the distinctive scar above the eye. "Hickory," Nina whispered, her voice cracking. Charlotte's heart hammered as she eased open the side door, praying the hinges wouldn't squeal. She crept forward, her senses sharp, every muscle tensed. As she reached the stall, the horse inside lifted his head, ears flicking forward. For a heartbeat, there was only silence. Then Hickory pushed his nose through the bars, nostrils flaring as he took in the familiar scent. Charlotte choked on a sob she hadn't realized she was holding. She pressed her face to the horse's cheek, whispering, "You waited for us, didn't you, old boy? You held on." Nina darted to her side, throwing her arms around Hickory's neck. The horse stood perfectly still, a living anchor in the chaos of their world. He nickered softly, a sound so gentle it broke something open in both of them. A flood of relief, gratitude, and love. Charlotte held Nina close, blinking back tears. In that moment, the barn felt brighter, as if the sun itself had found its way through the holes in the roof. They heard a door slam outside, the thump of boots, a sharp voice cursing about a missing wrench. Charlotte tensed, signaling for Nina to stay quiet. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she stood tall, meeting the gaze of Wade's cousin when he finally wandered in. The man stopped dead in the doorway, surprise turning to irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he barked. Charlotte squared her shoulders, anger burning in her veins. "I'm the owner of this horse," she said, voice cold as the wind, "and you have about 5 seconds to explain why he's in your barn." The cousin bristled, but before he could answer, Marcy's cruiser pulled up in a swirl of dust, lights flashing. The deputy stepped out, one hand on her radio, the other resting on her belt. "Is there a problem here?" she called, voice steady and full of authority. Charlotte let out a long, shaky breath. "Not anymore," she replied, stroking Hickory's neck, feeling the horse's steady heartbeat beneath her hand. Marcy's presence diffused the tension, and Wade's cousin backed down, muttering about stray animals and misunderstandings. But Charlotte saw the guilt in his eyes. She knew the truth, and so did Marcy. With a final, lingering glance at the barn, Charlotte led Hickory out into the sunlight. Nina walked beside her, one hand buried in the gelding's mane, the other clutching the GPS device that had brought them back together. The road home felt different this time. Not shorter, not easier, but suffused with the fierce relief of a promise kept. As the ranch faded behind them, Charlotte glanced at Nina in the rearview mirror. For the first time in days, the girl smiled, a real, unguarded smile, as bright as the morning sky. They had found their way through the storm. Together. The sun was already dipping low by the time Charlotte turned the old Chevy pickup onto the winding county road that led back to the Keene property. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the cab was filled with something close to relief, a fragile piece that shimmered just beneath the surface, ready to break at the slightest bump. Hickory, now safely tethered in the trailer behind them, whinnied softly every few minutes, as if reminding them that he was still there, still waiting for home. Nina sat pressed against the window, her hands wrapped tight around her favorite sketchbook, watching the world blur by in shades of gold and blue. Charlotte's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her mind cycled between gratitude and anger. Gratitude for getting Hickory back? Anger at Wade Clay, at the injustice, at the way things worked in a town where men like Wade always seemed to get away with something. But tonight, anger took a back seat. All that mattered was Hickory coming home and the look of exhausted joy on Nina's face as she watched the familiar landmarks pass by. Fields she'd drawn in her notebooks, the leaning cottonwood where she and her mother used to pick wildflowers, the broken fence post that had started everything. As they pulled into the drive, the barn stood waiting for them, its weathered boards painted gold by the sunset. Charlotte killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the engine tick and cool, before reaching out to squeeze Nina's shoulder. "We did it," she said softly, voice rough with emotion. Nina nodded, her eyes shining, but said nothing. The words didn't matter. The look on her face said, Everything. They moved together, almost in a trance, as they opened the trailer. Hickory, though tired and sore, stepped out with surprising steadiness, his eyes bright and searching. He snorted at the cool evening air, ears flicking at every familiar sound: the creak of the gate, the hush of wind through the grass, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Charlotte led him straight to his stall, where fresh straw waited and a bucket of sweet mash sat steaming in the corner. Nina hovered just behind, not daring to touch him yet. When Hickory reached his stall, he paused, as if recognizing the place. He lowered his head, breathing in the scent of his own hay, the familiar dust, the mingled traces of girl and woman and memories new and old. He turned, and, for the first time since being taken, nickered, a low, rolling sound that seemed to shake loose every worry inside Charlotte's chest. Nina stepped forward, reaching out slowly, her hand trembling. Hickory leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, as if the world outside the barn walls could finally be forgotten. Nina let out a shaky laugh. One hand pressed to her heart, tears shining on her cheeks. Charlotte stood back, watching them, her own vision blurring. For a moment, the barn felt less like a building and more like a sanctuary, a place where broken things could mend, where hope might take root. She watched as Nina fed Hickory handfuls of sweet mash, murmuring nonsense words that seemed to soothe them both. The barn filled with the warm, earthy smell of horse and straw, the soft clatter of hooves, and the kind of silence that felt safe, not empty. Later, after Hickory was settled and Nina had finally come inside to eat, Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, rubbing her tired eyes. The phone rang. It was Marcy. They hauled Wade in for questioning, Marcy reported, her voice tight. Claims he didn't know a thing, of course, no charges filed. Sheriff says there's not enough evidence. You know how it is, Charlotte grunted. That's it then? He just gets away with it? Word's already spreading, Char, Marcy said quietly. People talk. You can bet the showcase won't let him back next season. He lost 3 feed contracts today. Sometimes justice is slower than we want, but it finds a way. Charlotte let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Thanks, Marcy, for everything. After she hung up, Charlotte sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the house, the rattle of the furnace, Nina's soft laughter drifting in from the living room as she tried to teach herself a new card game, the faint shuffle of Hickory moving in a stall. Life, she realized, wasn't about grand victories. It was about small mercies, quiet moments, the stubborn persistence of love in the face of loss. Before bed, Nina insisted on saying goodnight to Hickory. Charlotte watched from the barn door as her granddaughter knelt beside the stall, laying her cheek against the gelding's neck. I missed you, she whispered, her voice so quiet Charlotte almost didn't hear it. I'm glad you came home. Hickory breathed deep, his warm breath curling around Nina's hair. For the first time in weeks, the girl looked at peace. A kind of peace Charlotte hadn't dared hope for since Rachel died. The next morning the veterinarian came. Dr. Yates was a kindly woman, quick with a gentle word and a steady hand. She examined Hickory thoroughly, clucking her tongue at the horse's rough treatment, the patchy coat, the stress lines, the slight swelling around the old wounds. He's lucky, Dr. Yates said, scratching Hickory's nose. No broken bones, just signs of rough handling and a little malnutrition. He needs rest, kindness, and time. She gave Charlotte a stern look. He's safe here. But you call me if anything changes. I will, Charlotte promised, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. That week, news spread fast. Wade Clay, once so smug and self-assured, found himself on the wrong side of local opinion. People who'd once done business with him now kept their distance. The ranchers who ran the showcase circuit made it clear he wasn't welcome back. No sheriff's charges, no trial. But justice took its own shape. Quiet, relentless, unspoken. Charlotte didn't say anything to Nina about it. She let the world settle itself. Some fights were better left to their own slow burn. What mattered most was here. Nina, Hickory, the battered barn that now held more laughter than sorrow. In the evenings, Charlotte and Nina worked together, repairing fences, cleaning stalls, dreaming up plans for a new side barn. A north fence project, Nina called it, her eyes alight with purpose. Hickory would have a proper home, and maybe, just maybe, so would a few more horses who needed a second chance. One night, after chores were done and the sky shimmered with stars, Charlotte found Nina curled up by Hickory's stall, sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing a picture of the barn, its doors flung wide, light spilling out across the yard. Above the door, in bold, hopeful letters, she wrote, "Welcome home." Charlotte knelt beside her, pulled the girl close, and let herself believe, for the first time in too long, that home was not something you lost, but something you built, one piece at a time, with love, forgiveness, and the simple courage to start again. The harshness of winter finally gave way to spring's gentle promise. The Montana plains, once blanketed by snow and silence, awakened with bursts of wildflowers, green grass pushing up through the thawing earth, and the crisp air alive with the calls of meadowlarks. For Charlotte, every sign of new growth felt like a small miracle, proof that the world could heal itself after all. But the biggest change of all was not in the landscape. It was in the barn, and in the hearts of those who called it home. It started one morning as Charlotte and Nina stood side by side, surveying a patch of ground near the northern edge of the property. The old barbed wire fence sagged with age, weathered by years of wind and neglect. Charlotte squinted into the rising sun, picturing something new, something better. "We could build it here," Nina said, her voice stronger and more certain than it had been all winter. She clutched her sketchbook, pages fluttering with blueprints and half-formed dreams. A new side barn, for Hickory, and maybe more horses. You know, the quiet ones. Charlotte smiled. The North Fence Project, huh? She liked the way the words sounded, proud and determined, like something that would last. Nina nodded eagerly. We could help other kids too, the ones who need a place. So they got to work. Day by day, piece by piece, the North Fence barn began to take shape. Charlotte called in favors from old friends and neighbors, people who remembered her husband's kindness, or Rachel's laughter, or just like the idea of building something good. Some showed up with tools and strong backs, others brought boards, nails, or leftover shingles from their own ranches. Even Marcy came by on her day off, hammering nails and telling wild stories that made Nina giggle. But the heart of the work was Charlotte and Nina, shoulders pressed together as they dug post holes, measured beams, and hammered boards into place. Hickory watched the construction from his pasture, sometimes dozing in the sun, sometimes wandering over to inspect their progress with a nudge of his velvet nose. The barn grew quickly, nothing fancy, just sturdy walls, a weather-tight roof, and a wide doorway facing north toward the open fields. They painted the boards a cheerful green, the color of new leaves. Charlotte insisted on thick insulation. Montana winters don't mess around. While Nina decorated the inside with her drawings. Horses, children, sunrises, and always Hickory with his wise, gentle eyes. Word spread through the county, as it always did. At first, it was just a trickle. One neighbor asking if his nephew could visit after school, then a mother calling to see if her shy daughter might help with chores. Some kids were loud and curious. Others were quiet, their pain hiding in the set of their shoulders or the way they refused to meet anyone's gaze. Charlotte recognized the signs. She'd seen it in Nina, and in her own way, she'd carried it herself. The North Fence Project quickly became a haven for the quiet ones. On Saturdays, the barn buzzed with low voices and laughter, children brushing Hickory's coat, cleaning tack, or simply sitting in the hayloft sketching pictures and reading stories aloud. Charlotte watched them from the corner, hands in her pockets, the sting of tears more common now, though softer, less bitter than before. Hickory became a magnet for those children, just as he had for Nina. There was something about the old gelding's steady presence, the way he listened without judging, his patience as endless as the prairie sky. Kids who hadn't spoken a word in months would find themselves whispering into his ear, sharing secrets they'd kept locked away even from themselves. Hickory would flick his ears, nuzzle his shoulder, and give them the quiet comfort they needed. Nina thrived in this new world. She became the unofficial tour guide, teaching younger kids how to mix mash, showing them the safest way to clean hooves, reading horse stories aloud in a clear, ringing voice. She wore her courage like a badge, growing braver each day. Charlotte would sometimes catch her standing at the open door of the barn, arms spread wide, laughing as the wind tangled her hair. For Charlotte, the greatest joy was found in the ordinary moments, mending a broken latch, sharing lemonade in the shade, watching Nina lead a nervous child to Hickory's stall, and seeing them both transform. It was in these quiet victories that she felt Rachel's spirit strongest. Her presence woven through every board and every breath of spring air. One afternoon, after a day spent painting trim and replacing shingles, Nina gathered all the visiting children in front of Hickory's stall. She held a battered can of green paint and a brush, eyes alight with excitement. "It's time," she declared. "We have to make it official." With Charlotte watching, Nina dipped the brush into the paint and, with slow, careful strokes, wrote Hickory's name in big, bright letters above the stall door. The other kids cheered, each taking a turn to sign their own names in smaller letters around his. When they were done, the stall looked like a living mural, full of color, hope, and the marks of many hands. That evening, as the sun set behind the barn, Charlotte and Nina stood in the doorway, watching the shadows lengthen across the field. Hickory grazed peacefully nearby, his coat glossy, his head held high. You did it," Charlotte said softly, squeezing Nina's shoulder. "You made this place something special." Nina smiled, her face radiant in the golden light. "We did it," she replied. "Together." As darkness settled over the ranch, Charlotte realized that the fences she'd once built to keep danger out had, over time, become the very thing that let hope in. The barn wasn't just a shelter for horses and children. It was a home for all the broken, healing things in the world, herself included. She felt Rachel's memory in every breeze, saw her husband's kindness in every nail driven straight, and heard her granddaughter's laughter echoing in the rafters. The past would always be there, but so would the future, rising green and strong at the north fence, ready to meet the dawn. If this story reminded you of someone who waded through the storm with you, hit like and subscribe. Healing doesn't gallop in. Sometimes it just walks beside you. Ari, 1 year later, a soft spring breeze rustled the birch trees along the keen fence line. The Montana sky was the color of fresh-washed denim, vast and endless, promising more gentle days ahead. The pain of last winter's losses was still there, but it had softened. Like an old scar, no longer raw, simply a part of the landscape. On this Saturday morning, laughter echoed across the pasture. The North Fence project was no longer just a barn and a dream. It was a living place, full of children, horses, and the simple acts of care and kindness that stitched together broken hearts. Local families parked along the drive. Kids tumbled out with lunches and books and muddy boots, ski coats. Even the neighboring ranchers had come around, dropping by to see what all the fuss was about, to lend a hand, or just swap stories by the fence. Nina had grown tall, her hair sun-streaked and wild. She was in the barn early, laying out brushes and buckets for the day's lessons. Hickory waited for her by the gate, as patient as ever, his old wounds nothing more than faint lines under a gleaming coat. He had become more than just a rescue. He was the anchor of the whole project, a gentle reminder that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt one step at a time. Charlotte watched it all from the porch, her boots propped on the railing, a mug of coffee warming her hands. She'd spent much of her life fighting for control, holding grief at bay with hard work and routine. Now she allowed herself to simply be. She marveled at the life growing up around her, new fences, laughter, and hope threading through each day. Every once in a while, she'd catch a glimpse of Rachel in the tilt of Nina's head, or the way she smiled when a nervous child finally reached out to touch Hickory's nose. This particular day, the barn was bustling with new faces. A shy boy named Henry stood awkwardly near the gate, clutching a well-loved book and refusing to make eye contact. Nina noticed him right away. She always saw the ones who felt invisible because she'd been that child not so long ago. She knelt beside Henry, speaking in the gentle, matter-of-fact way she'd learned from Charlotte. "You want to help me brush Hickory's back?" she asked, holding out a soft, bristled brush. Henry hesitated, biting his lip, but the kindness in Nina's voice worked its quiet magic. He nodded and followed her to Hickory's side. Nina spoke softly, showing him how to move slowly, how to let the horse sniff his hand first, how to stroke along the grain of the coat. Hickory stood perfectly still, his tail swishing gently, his head lowered to Henry's level. The boy reached out, his fingers trembling at first, then steadied by Nina's encouragement. Charlotte, watching from a distance, felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sweet, aching pride of seeing her granddaughter carry forward all the best parts of their family. As the day unfolded, kids took turns leading Hickory through a small obstacle course, cones, a low pole, a patch of rustling tarps just like the showcase had taught them. There was no competition here, no ribbons or trophies, only the soft applause of friends and the shared joy of accomplishment. One girl, who hadn't spoken a word since her parents' divorce, giggled when Hickory nuzzled her sleeve, the sound ringing like a bell in the bright morning air. Later, after chores and lessons were done, Nina gathered everyone in the barn. They sat in a circle on hay bales, dust motes spinning in the sunlight. Nina opened her favorite book of horse stories and began to read aloud, her voice strong and clear, the words flowing over everyone like a warm tide. Hickory stood nearby, eyes half closed, as if listening too. When she finished, Henry, still shy, but braver now, looked up and asked, "Did Hickory fix you when you were sad?" The barn fell silent. Nina looked down, considering. Charlotte held her breath, knowing the weight of that question. Nina smiled, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "He didn't fix me," she said. "He just stayed until I wasn't broken anymore." The words hung in the air, simple and true. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were soft. Gratitude, not grief. The group drifted out to the pasture, laughter chasing away the last of the shadows. Charlotte stayed behind for a moment, her gaze lingering on the barn's wide door, painted green and marked with so many handprints. She ran her hand along the smooth wood, remembering the pain of the year before, the fear, the anger, the night she'd thought she'd lost everything. She remembered, too, the people who'd stood by her, Marcy's steady voice, Dale's quiet help, the neighbors who had come together to build something new. Some fences, she realized, didn't keep danger out. They let hope in. And she walked to the fence line, boots leaving gentle prints in the dust. The breeze carried the scent of grass, of horses, of the lilacs that Rachel had planted so long ago. Charlotte closed her eyes and breathed it all in. Evening fell softly, the sky streaked with lavender and gold. As dusk settled, Charlotte called Nina in for supper, her voice carrying across the field. Nina waved, running up the path, her face flushed and bright with life. That night, as Charlotte tucked Nina into bed, she lingered a moment longer. "I'm proud of you, kiddo," she whispered, pressing a kiss to Nina's forehead. "You found your way through the storm." Nina smiled sleepily. "We did it together, Grandma." Charlotte turned out the light, leaving the door cracked so the girl could hear the quiet sounds of the ranch, the horses shifting in the barn, the wind in the eaves, the promise of another gentle day ahead. Before sleep took her, Charlotte let herself hope for the future, not as something to be feared, but as something to be welcomed, one hoofprint at a time. And if this story touched you or reminded you of someone who stood by your side, don't forget to like and subscribe. Maybe healing is slower than we hope, but when we let hope in, it always finds a way.